Hey everybody, I'm Tony and welcome back to my channel and to part 2 of my series on mapping Midi keyboard controls to Studio One native plugins. We will start with Studio One and keyboard setup. If you already use Studio One, you're no doubt familiar with external keyboard setup. And if your brand and model is supported by Studio One, you will likely have a pre-installed MIDI template, which is already linked to your keyboard and is ready for mapping to your plugins. Now I am using an S88 MK2 for this tutorial, and if I open up the MK2 template in External Instruments and put my S88 into MIDI mode using the default MIDI template, I see that my keyboard's knobs and buttons are linked to Studio One with no additional work required by me. And I can shift between the available rows of knobs by way of the left and right arrow buttons on my keyboard. However, this template is limited to one row of buttons and 2 rows of control knobs for a total of only 24 mappable controls. And so this setup is quite bare bones, considering that we can custom map up to 64 controls per template. So I also have Complete Control open, and so let's switch our focus onto the Complete Control side of things by putting it into MIDI Editor mode. You should note that activating MIDI Editor in Complete Control deactivates much of the keyboard's functionality. So you should only activate the MIDI editor when you want to add or update templates, and then deactivate it again to release full control back to your keyboard. Once you press the MIDI button on the keyboard, you are back to the MIDI template that was active when you closed the editor. Looking at the knob section back in the editor again, we see the 2 pages of knobs which mirror the 2 rows of knobs in our Studio One session template, and the template cannot be edited. In the button section, the 2 pages of buttons are linked to the single row of buttons in the session template, and that is frankly kind of useless. So in short, this template does not make full use of the keyboard and software capability, and so I therefore will focus this tutorial on creating a keyboard template for my MK2 from scratch. And this process can be followed to map pretty much any maker model of keyboard. So let's take a look at my own S88 MK2 MIDI template, since it gives a good overview of how presence can be controlled from my keyboard, as well as showing how the template translates onto my MK2 keyboard screens. And then we can create it again from scratch. We'll start with how this template translates onto my keyboard screens when I switch to it using my preset buttons. You can see that I have tried to create sensible zones with the buttons, which control modules in presence, and then I mapped the corresponding parameters directly below the buttons. Note that I turned some buttons off and renamed those that remained. All of the knobs are named as well. More of the same on page 2, and you can see that I can also turn off knobs if desired. Reverb is a good example of creating a zone on one screen where I only have one active module on-off button with 4 reverb parameters set up below. The next screen is set up for delay in the same way. The third page is more of the same. Modulation zone on the first screen, and then basic control of FXB effects, gator, distortion, and pan on the second screen. And finally on page 4, I mapped EQ with the 7 bands mapped to my knobs and all named accordingly. I also added a button for lead and bass selection. Now before we get started, we need to take care of some housekeeping by first deleting and then reinstalling our keyboard in Studio One. When we add an external instrument, the supported device list represents only pre-mapped templates provided by Studio One, and these templates cannot be altered in any way, whether we like them or not. The keyboard's core functionality is provided by the manufacturer's driver, which is selected in the Receive From and Send To drop-down lists. And so removing your supported keyboard is only removing a pre-mapped template. So if you don't like the template provided by Studio One, you can instead take the new keyboard installation route. This method gives exactly the same functionality you had previously. The only difference is that you have the ability to create your own mapping template for Studio One, which is of course the whole point of this exercise. This only needs to be done one time, and once completed, Studio One will have access to every CC mapped control on your keyboard whenever you want it. So first we can remove the current keyboard. Now we can install the new one, and this time choose New Keyboard, and once again choose Complete Control 1 in the Receive From and Send To drop-down lists. It is also helpful to tick the Default Instrument Input option if you use two keyboards. And of course you should rename the keyboard however you like, since this name is what you will see throughout your DAW interface. After clicking OK, you now have full functionality restored, and all that is left to do is map our keyboard to Studio One. And that starts with setting up a suitable MIDI template in your standalone Complete Control app using the MIDI editor. So let's click the Add Template button and give it a name. Now click the Add Page button twice to get the third and fourth page. When you add two button pages, two knob pages are automatically added as well, or vice versa. Now you can see that page 1 and page 2 knobs have different names and CC assignments by default. But pages 3 and 4 do not, and so we must fix this manually. Page 2 left off on CC 29, and so we'll start with 30 on page 3 and work our way through to the end of page 4. And we won't bother renaming the knobs and buttons at this point, since this will be taken care of when we program the screen output. Now on to assigning CC numbers to all the buttons. And since only page 1 buttons are set up properly, I'll just start from scratch and pick up where I left off on knobs. Once all of the buttons and knobs have proper CC number assignments, we can then MIDI learn them all with our new blank mapping template in Studio One. But we aren't quite done with the MIDI editor, so don't close Complete Control just yet. Now our keyboard has buttons above knobs, and our MIDI template is divided into 4 pages. And so let's organize our mapping template in Studio One in the same way. So we put our mapping template into MIDI Learn mode, and start with page 1. Page 1 buttons are first up, and as you press each button in turn, you see them appear in the mapping template. Now let's stretch the window so the 8 buttons are lined up in a proper row, and then drag the window down to make room for the other 7 rows we're going to add. Midi Learn defaults to knobs, as you can see, but since we've mapped buttons here, let's just change the appearance accordingly by clicking the drop-down triangle in the top right corner and choosing Button On/Off. Now let's switch to knobs and add the first row. Oops. And if you make a mistake like I just did, just remove it like so and pick up where you left off. So by mapping 1 row of buttons and 1 row of knobs, you've now mapped page 1 of your template. Now continue the same process until you have completed all 4 pages for a total of 64 mapped controls. Use your keyboard to test every button and knob on all 4 pages while watching the mapping template to be sure you have no MIDI number duplicates. You will know you have duplicates when pushing a button or turning a knob operates more than 1 control parameter on the mapping template, in which case you will need to go back and check your number assignments for duplicates in the MIDI editor. So to summarize our progress thus far, we already have complete control open and in MIDI mode, and so we will leave it open so we can fine-tune our keyboard MIDI template as needed. We already have our Studio One default mapping template, which is already mapped to our keyboard. And finally, we have an instance of Presence open, and so let's just duplicate the template I previewed since it has a little of everything. First, click the gear to the left of the yellow box, and this activates the mapping controls. Next, set the instrument focus to your new keyboard by selecting it on the drop-down list like so. If the box is not yellow after selecting your keyboard, click it again and it turns yellow. This is the key to making your mapping apply across your entire Presence library. If Presence is in focus mode, mapping a parameter results in a yellow triangle. If the controller focus is turned off and not yellow, mapping results in a blue triangle, which means the setting only applies to the open preset. So in short, yellow maps the instrument and blue maps the preset. So let's start with page 1 and the instrument bypass button. Left-click the bypass and it appears in the left side of the mapping console. Now click button 1 on page 1 of your keyboard and it appears in the right side of the mapping console under the name shown in your mapping template. Now click the triangle between the two and it should turn yellow. If the mapping was completed successfully, it will now become active in the mapping template when you operate the keyboard. The next button is inactive on our screen, and so let's pop over to the MIDI editor to deactivate it. Click button 2 and then left click the assign button and choose off, and this removes button 2 from screen 1. Now let's use buttons 3 and 4 to activate LFO1 and LFO2 respectively. Click LFO1 to make it active. Press button 3 to make it active. Click the triangle, which turns yellow, and now it is mapped as well. Repeat the same steps for LFO2. LFO2 active, button 4 active. Click the triangle and create the mapping. Now map the knobs on screen 1 of page 1. Make the volume active, turn knob 1, and then click triangle to complete the mapping. Repeat for velocity, LFO1 rate, and LFO2 rate. So page 1, screen 1 is now completed, except for naming the parameters on screen. And so let's go to the MIDI editor and do that. On the buttons page, double-click on each CC number below the buttons and rename each button as required. Now switch to the knobs page and do the same. So I think that is all I need to cover, but I will spend a minute on EQ since it involves faders, and you will find the EQ module in the FXB section of Presence. Switch Presence to FXB and activate EQ. Then switch the MIDI editor to page 4 and activate button 1, and then map it. Activate Lead under EQ in Presence, and then activate button 2, and then map again. Activate the remaining buttons in turn, and change the sign to off, and then switch to the knobs page. Mouse control each fader in Presence, and after activating the corresponding knobs, map each one in turn. Now name the active buttons and knobs as required. And lastly, let's turn to the mapping template. Buttons 1 through 7 on the last row are assigned to faders, and so let's activate MIDI Learn once more and change the 7 controls to fader view, like so. And to save your newly mapped version of Presence as the default Presence instrument, just left-click on the Document button and choose Store as Default Preset. After clicking Yes, whenever you open Presence in future, you will automatically have all these settings at your disposal, regardless of the instrument you have loaded. Just don't forget that you need to be in MIDI mode on your keyboard, and you need to load your new MIDI template in complete control. So I think I will wrap it up there, and I hope that this tutorial will assist you in setting up your own gear in Studio One, regardless of whatever keyboard or plugins you happen to use. And so if you could like this video, that would be huge. And if you subscribed, that would be even more amazing. Of course, your questions and feedback are most welcome, as always, and I look forward to hearing from you. Take care, and we'll see you on the next video.